September 3rd, 1260, the Jezreel Valley in northern Palestine. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after dawn, visible for miles across the flat plain. Mamluk scouts, positioned in the hills above Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, watched as the Mongol army approached. These were the horsemen who had conquered everything from Korea to Hungary, who had destroyed every army that dared face them in open battle for nearly 40 years. The Mamluks, slave soldiers who had seized power in Egypt just months earlier, were about to attempt what no army had successfully done since the Mongols first erupted from the steppes: stop them. The commander of the Mongol forces, Kitbuqa Noyan, was a Nestorian Christian who had served Genghis Khan's grandsons for decades. He had participated in the sack of Baghdad just 2 years earlier, watching as the Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world for 500 years, was extinguished in a week of systematic slaughter. He had conquered Aleppo and Damascus, ancient cities that had survived Roman sieges and Crusader assaults, and seen them submit without meaningful resistance. His army of approximately 20,000 men represented the western edge of an empire that stretched 6,000 miles, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Against him stood Qutuz, the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, and his most capable general, Baibars. Both men were former slaves, trained from childhood in the brutal military academies of Cairo, where boys purchased from Turkish tribes were transformed into the Islamic world's most effective heavy cavalry. They commanded roughly 20,000 men, mostly Mamluks reinforced by Arab auxiliaries and Syrian volunteers who had fled the Mongol advance. The two armies were roughly equal in numbers, a rarity for the Mongols who typically achieved overwhelming numerical superiority through their mobilization system. But what made Ain Jalut unique wasn't the numbers. It was that for the first time, the Mongols faced an enemy who truly understood their tactics, who had studied their methods, and who possessed the discipline and cavalry skill to counter them. The Mongol military system was the most sophisticated in the 13th century world. Built on principles of mobility, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and coordinated combined arms tactics, it had destroyed kingdoms from China to Poland. The foundation was the Mongol horse, a small hardy breed capable of travelling 60 miles per day while living off grass that would starve European horses. Each Mongol warrior maintained a string of 4 to 6 horses, allowing them to rotate mounts and maintain relentless operational tempo that exhausted enemies. The composite bow, constructed from horn, wood and sinew, could pierce armour at 200 yards and was effective at ranges up to 350 yards. Mongol warriors trained from childhood, learning to shoot accurately from horseback at full gallop. The standard quiver held 60 arrows with different types for different purposes: light arrows with narrow heads for distance shooting, heavy arrows with broad heads for close-range penetration, whistling arrows for signalling, and fire arrows for siege work. But the true genius of Mongol warfare wasn't individual weapons or horsemanship. It was their tactical system, refined over decades of conquest. The Mongol army was organized in decimal units. 10 men formed an arban, 10 arbans formed a jagun of 100 men, 10 jaguns formed a mingan of 1,000 men, and 10 mingans formed a tumen of 10,000 men. This system allowed for rapid communication and flexible response. Orders could flow from the supreme commander to individual units in minutes, even in armies spread across miles of battlefield. The standard Mongol tactic was the feigned retreat, a maneuver so consistently successful it became almost monotonous. Light cavalry would engage the enemy, loose clouds of arrows, then turn and flee. The enemy, convinced they were winning, would break formation to pursue. Once the enemy was disorganized and strung out, Mongol heavy cavalry would emerge from concealed positions and annihilate them. This tactic had destroyed Polish and German knights at Liegnitz, Russian princes at the Kalka River, Hungarian armies at Mohi, and countless Chinese and Persian forces across Asia. Psychological warfare was equally important. The Mongols cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. Cities that resisted were obliterated, their entire populations massacred as examples. Cities that surrendered were usually spared, though subject to heavy tribute. This created a psychological dynamic where resistance seemed futile and submission rational. The very approach of a Mongol army caused panic, with populations fleeing before them and rulers abandoning their cities. Intelligence gathering was obsessive. Mongol forces were always preceded by extensive reconnaissance. merchants, spies, and captured prisoners provided detailed information about enemy forces, terrain, political situations, and potential allies. The Mongols knew more about their enemies than their enemies knew about themselves. By the time battle was joined, the Mongols had usually engineered conditions in their favour. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 exemplified Mongol methods at their most terrifying. The city, home to perhaps 1 million people, was surrounded by Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis. When the Caliph refused to surrender, the Mongols systematically demolished the city's fortifications using Chinese siege engineers and equipment transported thousands of miles for this purpose. Once the walls were breached, the slaughter began. Estimates suggest between 200,000 and 1,000 people were killed over several weeks. The House of Wisdom, the greatest library in the Islamic world, was destroyed, with books thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the river reportedly ran black with ink. The Caliph was executed, allegedly rolled in a carpet, and trampled to death, ending the 500-year-old Abbasid dynasty. After Baghdad fell, nothing seemed capable of stopping the Mongol advance. Aleppo fell in January 1260 after a siege lasting only 5 days. Damascus surrendered without resistance in March. The Mongol forces pushed south into Palestine, seemingly unstoppable. Christian states in the region, including the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, allied with the Mongols, seeing them as potential liberators from Muslim rule. The Islamic world was in existential crisis, its greatest city destroyed, its caliphate eliminated, its armies repeatedly defeated. Egypt under the Mamluks was the last major Islamic power standing. But the Mamluks were different from the armies the Mongols had previously faced. The Mamluk system had originated decades earlier as a solution to military vulnerability. Young boys, typically 10 to 14 years old, were purchased from Turkish tribes in the Caucasus and Central Asia. These boys were brought to Cairo and subjected to brutal military training in a system called the Furusiyya. They learned horsemanship until they could control their mounts with their knees, leaving both hands free for weapons. They trained with a composite bow until they could loose arrows accurately at full gallop. They practiced with lance, sword, and mace in close combat. They studied military tactics, logistics, and leadership. Crucially, they were isolated from Egyptian society, living in barracks on an island in the Nile, creating intense unit cohesion and loyalty to their military caste rather than to families or tribes. After 10 to 15 years of this training, they were freed and became full Mamluk warriors. These men were professional soldiers in a way that European knights or even Mongol warriors were not. They had no other identity, no other purpose. They were living weapons, and their entire existence centered on martial excellence. The Mamluk heavy cavalryman was among the most formidable warriors in the medieval world. Armoured in lamella or mail, wielding a composite bow nearly equal to Mongol weapons, trained to charge home with lance or fight in close quarters with sword and mace, they combined the mobility of steppe cavalry with the shock power of heavy cavalry. In 1250, these Mamluk warriors had seized power in Egypt, overthrowing the Ayyubid dynasty and establishing their own sultanate. This political instability might have seemed like weakness, but it meant that Egypt was now ruled by its military elite rather than by hereditary monarchs. The sultanate was a meritocracy of violence. The most capable warriors rose to leadership, and military effectiveness was the primary criterion for advancement. When Hulagu Khan's envoys arrived in Cairo in 1260 demanding Egypt's surrender, Sultan Qutuz executed them, a deliberate act of defiance. The envoys had carried the standard Mongol ultimatum: submit and live, or resist and be destroyed. Qutuz's response was unambiguous: Egypt would fight. But Qutuz understood he couldn't simply meet the Mongols in open battle using conventional tactics. Every army that had tried that approach had been destroyed, so he studied them. Mamluk intelligence gathered information from Syrian refugees, from merchants who had traded with Mongol-controlled territories, from the few survivors of previous battles. They learned the Mongol tactics, their feigned retreats, their use of concealed reserves, their preference for drawing enemies into prepared killing zones. More importantly, Qutuz learned that the Mongol invasion force was not at full strength. Hulagu had returned to Mongolia with the bulk of his army, following the death of the great Khan Möngke. Succession disputes required his presence and his military strength back in the Mongol heartland. He had left Kitbuqa with perhaps 20,000 men to hold the conquests in Syria and Palestine. For the first time, the Mongols would not have their usual crushing numerical advantage. Qutuz also secured his strategic rear. He negotiated a truce with the Crusaders, ensuring they wouldn't attack Egypt while his army marched north. Some Crusader states, recognizing the Mongols as the greater threat, even provided limited assistance or allowed Mamluk forces to move through their territory. By July 1260, Qutuz had assembled his army and marched north from Egypt. His strategic goal was to intercept the Mongols before they could reach the Nile Delta, where Egypt's agricultural heartland and population centers lay. His tactical goal was to force battle on terrain of his choosing and to implement a battle plan specifically designed to counter Mongol methods. The location chosen was Ain Jalut, a spring in the Jezreel Valley that had been the site of battles since ancient times. The terrain offered several advantages. The valley was enclosed by hills where forces could be concealed. Multiple routes allowed for envelopment maneuvers, and crucially, there was only one good water source, the spring itself, which the Mamluks controlled. Any Mongol army approaching would need to fight for water. Qutuz divided his forces. The main body, perhaps 12,000 men, was concealed in the hills around the valley. A smaller force of about 1,000 cavalry under Baibars was positioned in the open valley as bait. The plan was audacious. They would use the Mongols' own favourite tactic against them, the feigned retreat. But to work, it required perfect timing, iron discipline, and warriors capable of retreating in good order while under pressure without actually breaking. Only the Mamluks possessed the training and cohesion to attempt such a manoeuvre. When Kitbuqa's scouts reported a small Mamluk force at Ain Jalut, he advanced to engage them. The Mongols had never lost a major engagement in the west. They had destroyed every army from the Jin dynasty in China to the Kingdom of Hungary. A force of 1,000 enemy cavalry seemed like a minor obstacle. On the morning of Diem, September 3rd, the Mongol advance guard made contact with Baibars' force. The Mamluks loosed arrows, then turned and retreated. This was exactly what Mongol enemies always did, and it always ended the same way. The Mongols pursued, shooting as they advanced, expecting the enemy to break and scatter. But the Mamluks didn't scatter. They maintained formation, retreating at a controlled pace, just fast enough to stay ahead of the Mongol pursuit, but not so fast that they lost cohesion. Mongol commanders had seen disciplined retreats before, but usually only for short distances before the enemy formation collapsed. The Mamluks kept retreating, drawing the Mongols deeper into the valley. Kitbuqa committed more forces. His light cavalry swept forward, trying to envelop the retreating Mamluks. His heavy cavalry followed, ready to deliver the killing blow once the enemy was fixed in place. The Mongol formation began to string out as faster units outpaced slower ones, a natural consequence of pursuit. This was the critical moment, the point where the feigned retreat either worked or led to disaster. If the Mamluks broke and ran, they would be ridden down and slaughtered. If they turned to fight too early, before the Mongols were fully committed and extended, the trap wouldn't work. Baibars kept his men retreating, holding discipline through personal example, and the years of training that made his warriors respond to commands even under extreme pressure. Then, when the Mongols were strung out across the valley floor, miles from their starting position, Qutuz unleashed his concealed forces. Mamluk cavalry erupted from the hills on both flanks. Thousands of heavy cavalry appeared where moments before there had been empty landscape. The Mongol pursuit suddenly found itself in a closing trap, with fresh enemy forces attacking from three sides. The Mongols had faced ambushes before. Their response was usually to reform, to concentrate force at the point of enemy weakness, and to cut their way out. But the Mamluks didn't give them time. The flanking forces hit the Mongol line with devastating speed, while Baibars' supposedly retreating force turned and charged back into the Mongol van. What followed was not the usual Mongol battle of standoff archery duels and mobile maneuver. It was a close-quarters melee, heavy cavalry against heavy cavalry, exactly the kind of fighting where Mamluk training excelled. The lamella armour that both sides wore was effective against arrows, but less protective against lance points driven home by charging horses or maces wielded by powerful men. The initial Mongol response was controlled. Experienced commanders tried to organise their scattered forces, to create defensive formations that could hold until reinforcements arrived, or darkness allowed disengagement. Kitbuqa led from the front, rallying his men, demonstrating the personal courage that was expected of Mongol commanders. For hours, the battle raged across the valley. Floor. Units charged and countercharged. Men fought on foot when their horses were killed. The dust raised by thousands of hooves obscured vision, turning the battle into a series of small unit actions rather than a coordinated engagement. The Mamluks had numerical advantage only because their forces were concentrated while the Mongols were strung out from miles of pursuit. Individual Mongol units fought with their customary ferocity and skill, but they were fighting isolated actions against an enemy who had achieved local superiority. By early afternoon, the Mongol position was deteriorating. Their forces were fragmented, casualties were mounting, and critically they had lost control of the water source. In the heat of a Middle Eastern September, after hours of combat in armour, water was not a luxury but a necessity. Horses and men were suffering. Kitbuqa made the decision to withdraw, to break contact and retreat north to regroup. But the Mamluks wouldn't let them go. Qutuz committed his reserves, fresh cavalry that pursued the Mongol withdrawal. What had been an organised retreat began to fragment as exhausted Mongol units found themselves under continuous pressure. Individual warriors made the choice between dying in place or fleeing. Formations that had held for hours dissolved. The withdrawal became a rout. Kitbuqa and his personal guard were surrounded. The old warrior fought to the end, refusing to surrender. Contemporary sources describe him unhorsed, fighting with a mace, surrounded by dead Mamluks, until he was finally cut down. His death broke the last Mongol resistance. The surviving Mongol forces fled north. Some made it back to Syria, but many were hunted down during the pursuit. The Mongol army that had entered Palestine as conquerors left as fugitives. The casualties were catastrophic by medieval standards. Estimates suggest the Mongols lost half their force, perhaps 10,000 men. The Mamluks lost fewer, though still heavily. But numbers alone don't capture the significance of what happened at Ain Jalut. For the first time since the Mongols had emerged from the steppes nearly 40 years earlier, they had been decisively defeated in open battle by an opponent of roughly equal strength. The myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. The psychological impact rippled across the medieval world. In Syria, cities that had submitted to Mongol rule now revolted. Damascus expelled its Mongol garrison before the survivors of Ain Jalut even reached the city. Aleppo followed. The entire Mongol position in the Levant collapsed within weeks. The western advance of the Mongol Empire, which had seemed unstoppable, had been stopped. The strategic consequences were profound. The Mongols never again seriously threatened Egypt or the core of the Arab world. The Mamluk Sultanate survived for another 250 years, eventually falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1517. The Islamic world, which had seemed on the verge of complete conquest, maintained its independence and eventually recovered its strength. But perhaps more important than the strategic outcomes was what Ain Jalut revealed about the limitations of the Mongol system. The Mongols were not, as they had seemed, invincible. They were extraordinarily effective warriors with superior tactics and organization, but they could be beaten by an enemy who matched their mobility, understood their methods, and possessed the discipline to execute complex tactical plans under pressure. The feigned retreat, the tactic that had destroyed dozens of armies, had been used against them. The psychological warfare that had caused enemies to flee before battle had failed against warriors who were professional soldiers rather than feudal levies. The superior intelligence that usually gave them decisive advantage had been matched by an enemy who studied them systematically. The Mamluks had not defeated the Mongols through some secret weapon or lucky circumstance. They had defeated them by being better soldiers on that specific day, on that specific terrain, in that specific tactical situation. They had trained harder, planned better, and executed more effectively. In the decades following Ain Jalut, several attempts were made by later Mongol rulers to reclaim Syria and threaten Egypt. All failed. The Mamluks had learned how to fight Mongols, and they taught those lessons to their successors. The 1281 Battle of Homs saw another Mamluk victory using similar tactics. The 1299 Battle of Wadi al-Khazanda was a rare Mongol victory, but it led nowhere strategically. By 1303, at the Battle of Marj al-Safar, the Mamluks had refined their anti-Mongol tactics to such a degree that they achieved an even more decisive victory than Ain Jalut. The captured Mongol warriors from Ain Jalut provided valuable intelligence. Under interrogation, they confirmed what the Mamluks had suspected. The Mongol military system, while extraordinarily effective, had weaknesses. It required extensive grazing land for its huge horse herds. It struggled in urban terrain where mobility was restricted. It faced challenges in hot climates where water was scarce. and critically it was vulnerable to enemies who refused to break, who could maintain formation under pressure, and who could match their tactical sophistication. The Mamluks also learned that the Mongols were not mysterious steppe sorcerers, but professional soldiers like themselves. They used superior tactics, better organization, and psychological manipulation, but they were not superhuman. Once you understood their methods and possessed the training to counter them, they could be beaten. Qutuz did not long survive his victory. On the return journey to Egypt, he was assassinated by Baibars in a conspiracy involving several Mamluk emirs. Baibars claimed the Sultanate and ruled for 17 years as one of the most effective leaders in Mamluk history. His ruthless consolidation of power and aggressive military campaigns expanded Mamluk territory and crushed the remaining Crusader states. In a final historical irony, Baibars himself was from a Turkic tribe closely related to those that supplied warriors to the Mongol armies. He understood steppe warfare from childhood, and he used that knowledge to defend the Islamic world against his distant kinsmen. The tactics he developed at Ain Jalut became standard Mamluk doctrine for dealing with steppe cavalry. The battle itself has been somewhat obscured by time. It lacks the cultural resonance in the West of battles like Agincourt or Waterloo. There are no contemporary European chronicles describing it in detail. The primary sources are Arabic and Persian, and the site itself has no impressive monuments or preserved battlefields like Gettysburg or Waterloo. But historians of military warfare recognize Ain Jalut as a pivotal engagement. It demonstrated that the Mongol tactical system, while revolutionary, was not unbeatable. It showed that disciplined heavy cavalry, properly led and employed on favourable terrain, could defeat steppe-light cavalry. It proved that the feigned retreat, while devastatingly effective against undisciplined enemies, could be turned against its practitioners. The Mongol Empire continued for another century, but its westward expansion was finished. The Ilkhanate that ruled Persia and the Middle East became a regional power rather than an expanding empire. Eventually it converted to Islam and was absorbed into the very civilization it had nearly destroyed. The Mamluks developed a military reputation that rivaled the Mongols. Their heavy cavalry became the elite force of the medieval Middle East, regularly defeating Crusader armies, Mongol incursions, and eventually the Timurids. The training system that produced warriors capable of standing firm against Mongol charges became legendary. By the 14th century, European military theorists were studying Mamluk tactics, trying to understand how they had achieved what no European army had done: defeat the Mongols in open battle. The lessons of Ain Jalut were clear but often ignored. Superior tactics could be countered by enemies who studied them and trained specifically to counter them. Psychological warfare failed against enemies who were professional soldiers with stronger unit cohesion than fear of death. Mobility and arranged firepower were powerful, but they could be negated by disciplined heavy cavalry willing to close to melee. Intelligence and planning could be matched by enemies who were equally systematic. On September 3rd, 1260, in a dusty valley in Palestine, the Mamluk Sultanate did what the Jin dynasty, the Khwarezmian Empire, the Kievan Rus, the Kingdom of Georgia, the Kingdom of Hungary, and the Abbasid Caliphate had failed to do. They met the Mongols in battle and won decisively. The charge that had broken armies from the Pacific to the Mediterranean finally broke against warriors who would not yield. The thunder of hooves that had struck terror across a continent was answered by the crash of Mamluk cavalry who knew no fear. In the history of military warfare, there are moments when established dominance is challenged and overturned. Ain Jalut was such a moment. The Mongols came to the field expecting another easy victory. They left it as refugees, their western conquests lost, their aura of invincibility shattered. The Mamluks entered the battle as desperate defenders facing the most feared army in the world. They left it as the victors who had done the impossible. The feigned retreat that had destroyed Hungarian knights and Russian princes had been turned against its masters. The composite bow that had riddled Chinese and Persian armies with arrows had met its match in warriors who were equally skilled archers. The mobility that had bewildered slower European forces had been matched by cavalry who could ride for days. The dust settled on Ain Jalut, revealing a new reality. The Mongols were not invincible. They could be studied, understood, and defeated. The empire that had seemed destined to conquer the world had reached its limit, and at that limit stood the Mamluks, slave soldiers who had become Egypt's military elite, warriors whose training and discipline had achieved what diplomacy and fortification had failed to accomplish. the spring at Ain Jalut still flows. The valley where history turned has returned to peaceful agriculture. No great monuments mark the spot where the Mongol advance was finally stopped, but in the history of warfare, in the story of how empires rise and fall, Ain Jalut stands as a testament to a fundamental truth. No military system, however effective, is unbeatable. No empire, however powerful, is unstoppable. And no army, however feared, is invincible. On September 3rd, 1260, the Mamluks proved it. The Mongol charge finally broke. The aftermath of Ain Jalut reverberated through the medieval world in ways that contemporaries only partially understood. In the Mongol court at Tabriz, news of the defeat arrived in October 1260, carried by exhausted survivors who had ridden for weeks to escape Mamluk pursuit. The reports were initially dismissed as exaggeration or cowardice. Mongol armies did not lose battles of this magnitude. Individual raids might fail, outlying units might be ambushed, but a full 2 men under an experienced commander did not simply cease to exist. Hulagu Khan, who had left Kitbuqa in command while he dealt with succession politics in Mongolia, reportedly flew into a rage when the full extent of the disaster became clear. According to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, who had access to Mongol court records, Hulagu demanded to know how an army that had destroyed Baghdad could be defeated by Egyptian slave soldiers. The answer, when his surviving commanders provided it, was uncomfortable. The Mamluks had fought like Mongols, using Mongol tactics, and they had fought better. The strategic situation facing Hulagu was dire. His brother Kublai was consolidating power as the new Great Khan, but rivals threatened civil war. Hulagu needed his military strength concentrated in Persia to maintain his own position as Khan, ruler of the Western territories. He could not spare forces for a major campaign to reclaim Syria while his political situation remained unstable. More fundamentally, the easy conquests were over. The enemies who remained were the ones who had proven they could fight. In Cairo, Baibars consolidated his power through a combination of military success and political ruthlessness. He had assassinated Qutuz, the man who had led the Mamluks to their greatest victory just weeks after Ain Jalut. The official justification was that Qutuz had been planning to return to Syria rather than Egypt, essentially abandoning the Sultanate. The real reason was simpler. Baibars wanted the throne, and he had the backing of enough Mamluk emirs to seize it. The new Sultan understood that Ain Jalut was not an ending, but a beginning. The Mongols would return. They had never accepted a major defeat without attempting to reverse it. Baibars spent the next 17 years preparing for that return, transforming the Mamluk Sultanate into a military machine specifically designed to counter Mongol warfare. The training regimen for new Mamluks became even more intensive. Young boys purchased from the slave markets of the Black Sea region underwent 15 years of martial education. The emphasis on horsemanship reached levels that bordered on obsessive. A fully trained Mamluk could mount and dismount a galloping horse from either side, could shoot accurately backwards while retreating, could control his mount with his knees while wielding lance and shield, and could ride for 12 hours straight with only brief rest stops. The weapons training extended beyond individual skill to unit tactics. Mamluks practiced coordinated charges in formations of 100, 500, and 1,000 horsemen. They drilled in the feigned retreat that had proven so effective at Ain Jalut, learning to retreat in good order while maintaining the ability to turn and countercharge on command. They studied the geography of Syria and Palestine, memorizing terrain features that could be used for ambush or defensive positions. Baibars also revolutionized military communications. He established a postal system using mounted couriers that could carry messages from Damascus to Cairo in 4 days, a journey that typically took 2 weeks. This barred system used relay stations with fresh horses, allowing riders to maintain high speeds over long distances. Intelligence about Mongol movements could reach Cairo while the Mongols were still assembling their forces, giving the Mamluks crucial time to mobilize. The fortification system was completely overhauled. Baibars recognized that the Mamluks could not defend every city and town against a major Mongol invasion. Instead, he focused on creating a network of strong points that could serve as refuges for the population and bases for mobile cavalry operations. Castles in Syria were rebuilt with thicker walls, deeper ditches, and better water supplies. The Crusader fortifications that the Mamluks captured were studied intensively, their architectural features adapted for use against Mongol siege techniques. The diplomatic offensive was equally important. Baibars sent embassies to the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that ruled Russia and the Western Steppes. The Golden Horde was increasingly hostile to the Ilkhanate over territorial disputes and religious differences. By cultivating this rivalry, Baibars ensured that Hulagu could never commit his full military strength against Egypt without worrying about attacks from the north. The Christian states that remained in the Levant faced a difficult strategic choice. The Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, reduced to a coastal strip after decades of defeats, had initially welcomed the Mongols as potential allies against the Muslims. Some Crusader lords had even provided troops to support Mongol operations. After Ain Jalut, this alliance looked considerably less attractive. The Mongols had been defeated, while the Mamluks controlled the interior and could cut off the Crusader ports from their agricultural hinterland. Baibars exploited this situation ruthlessly. He offered truces to those Crusader states that remained neutral, while systematically destroying those that maintained Mongol alliances. The Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, which had closely allied with the Mongols, found itself subject to devastating Mamluk raids that destroyed its economic base. The Principality of Antioch, another Mongol ally, was besieged and captured in 1268 in a campaign that demonstrated the Mamluks had learned siege warfare as effectively as field combat. The 1271 Mongol invasion attempt revealed how completely the strategic situation had changed. Kitbuqa Khan, Hulagu's son who succeeded him as Khan, assembled a force estimated at 30,000 men for a campaign to reclaim Syria. This was a substantial army, larger than the force that had fought at Ain Jalut, but it was not the overwhelming horde that had conquered Baghdad. Mongol military strength was divided between maintaining control over Persia, defending against the Golden Horde, and supporting campaigns in Afghanistan. The Mamluks met this invasion with a defensive strategy based on the lessons of Ain Jalut. Rather than immediately offering battle, they conducted a scorched earth policy in northern Syria. Wells were poisoned, crops destroyed, livestock driven south. The Mongol army, dependent on foraging for supplies, found itself in an increasingly hostile environment. Mamluk cavalry harassed the Mongol flanks and supply lines, avoiding decisive engagement while inflicting steady casualties. When Kitbuqa finally brought the Mamluks to battle near Homs in December 1271, the engagement was inconclusive. Both sides claimed victory, but the strategic outcome favoured the Mamluks. The Mongols were forced to withdraw due to supply shortages and the approach of winter. They had achieved nothing significant despite a major military effort. The conquest of Syria, which had seemed inevitable in 1260, was now impossible. The Battle of Elbistan in 1277 further demonstrated the shifting balance of power. A Mongol force invading Anatolia was ambushed by Mamluk cavalry, using terrain and timing to devastating effect. The Mongols lost thousands of men and withdrew in disorder. The tactics were pure Ain Jalut, a disciplined force using mobility and concentrated firepower to defeat an enemy that had expected an easy victory. By 1280, the strategic reality was clear to observers on both sides. The Mongol Empire had reached its western limit, not because of insurmountable geographical barriers or superior enemy forces, but because they faced an enemy who had figured out how to fight them. The Mamluks had transformed from desperate defenders to confident professionals who expected to win. The Mongol invasion of 1281 was the largest since Ain Jalut, with Kitbuqa assembling perhaps 50,000 men, including contingents from Armenia and Georgia. The Second Battle of Homs that resulted was one of the largest cavalry engagements of the medieval period, with over 100,000 horsemen engaged on a battlefield that stretched for miles. The Mamluks, under Sultan Qutuz, who had succeeded Baibars, deployed the full sophistication of their tactical system. The Mamluk army was organised in three main divisions. The right wing consisted of Syrian Mamluks, warriors who had extensive experience fighting Mongols and who knew the terrain intimately. The left wing was composed of Egyptian Mamluks, the elite troops from the Cairo barracks who represented the highest quality heavy cavalry in the Islamic world. The centre was held by the Sultan's personal guard, the royal Mamluks who had been trained at enormous expense and who represented the cutting edge of military professionalism. The Mongols attempted their traditional tactics. Light cavalry attempted to envelope the Mamluk flanks while maintaining a steady shower of arrows. Heavy cavalry prepared to exploit any weakness in the enemy formation. Contingents from subject peoples, Armenians and Georgians in this case, provided additional numbers and specialized capabilities. The The composite bows sang their distinctive note as thousands of arrows darkened the sky. But the Mamluks had faced this before. Their armour, a combination of lamellar plates and mail backed by padded garments, was specifically designed to defeat arrows at long range. Their shields, made of wood and leather with metal reinforcement, could absorb multiple hits. Their horses were also armoured, with chanfront protecting their heads and barding covering their bodies. This was not a light cavalry force that would scatter under arrow fire. This was heavy cavalry designed to weather the storm and close to decisive range. The Mamluk tactical response was textbook execution of doctrine developed over 20 years. The flanking divisions advanced at a controlled pace, maintaining formation and cohesion. When the Mongol light cavalry attempted to envelope them, the Mamluks didn't pursue or break formation. They maintained their advance, accepting casualties but refusing to be drawn out of position. The discipline required for this maneuver was extraordinary. Men saw their comrades falling and had to maintain their place in formation rather than charging forward in rage or fleeing in panic. When the range closed to about 200 yards, the Mamluks deployed their own archery. Mamluk composite bows were nearly equal to Mongol weapons, and the warriors wielding them had trained for years to shoot from horseback. The exchange of arrows became mutual, a deadly hail that claimed lives on both sides. But the Mamluks had a crucial advantage. They were advancing, closing the range, while the Mongols were attempting to maintain distance. Every minute brought the Mamluk heavy cavalry closer to lance range. The Mongol heavy cavalry attempted to meet the Mamluk charge, but they were outnumbered in this category. The Mongols had relied primarily on light cavalry throughout their conquests, using heavy cavalry as a supporting arm. The Mamluks were essentially all heavy cavalry, a solid mass of armoured horsemen advancing in disciplined formation. When the two forces met, the impact was tremendous. Contemporary descriptions of the melee are fragmentary and confused, as such accounts typically are. What is clear is that the fighting was savage and prolonged. Units charged and countercharged. Men fought on foot when their horses were killed. The dust raised by thousands of hooves created a fog that obscured command and control. Individual warriors found themselves in small unit actions, fighting men they could barely see in the choking dust. The critical moment came when the Mamluk centre, held in reserve, committed to the battle. Kalawun led his royal Mamluks directly at the Mongol command group, attempting to replicate the tactic that had killed Kitbuqa at Ain Jalut. The Mongol commanders, recognizing the danger, attempted to withdraw their headquarters element to a safer position. But this movement, conducted in the chaos of a fully engaged battle, was misinterpreted by other Mongol units as a general retreat. The psychology of combat is fragile. Units that are holding firm can suddenly collapse if they believe they are being abandoned. When Mongol warriors saw their command group falling back, some assumed the battle was lost. Individual units began to disengage, pulling back to avoid being trapped. This movement spread through the Mongol army like a contagion. What had been an organised, if desperate, defence became a confused withdrawal. The Mamluks pursued relentlessly. This was the doctrine developed after Ain Jalut. Don't let beaten enemies escape to fight again. Chase them until they are scattered, exhausted, and demoralised. The pursuit continued through the night and into the next day. Mongol units that had maintained some cohesion were ridden down by fresh Mamluk squadrons. Stragglers were hunted by local Arab tribesmen who had long memories of Mongol atrocities. Abaka escaped with a portion of his army, but the losses were catastrophic. Estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 Mongol dead, along with thousands captured. The Armenian and Georgian contingents were nearly wiped out, their kingdom's military strength shattered in a single afternoon. The Ilkhanat's ability to threaten Syria was broken for a generation. The 1299 invasion under Ghazan Khan represented one final attempt to reverse the verdict of Ain Jalut. Ghazan was an exceptional leader, a Mongol Khan who had converted to Islam and who understood both Mongol and Islamic military traditions. He assembled the largest force yet committed to the Western Front, possibly 60,000 men, and he planned his campaign with meticulous attention to logistics and supply. The Battle of Wadi al-Khazandar near Homs in December 1299 was a rare Mongol victory over the Mamluks. Ghazan's forces caught the Mamluk army in a tactical position where they could not fully deploy their heavy cavalry. The Mongols, fighting with better coordination than in previous campaigns, inflicted a severe defeat. Damascus fell to the Mongols for the first time since 1260. Syria seemed lost. but the occupation lasted only 4 months. Ghazan faced the same problems that had plagued every Mongol invasion since Ain Jalut. His army could not sustain itself in hostile territory. The supply lines back to Persia were too long and too vulnerable to Mamluk raiding. The local population was actively hostile, providing intelligence to the Mamluks and denying supplies to the Mongols. And the Mamluks themselves had not been destroyed, merely defeated in a single battle. When Ghazan withdrew to deal with other problems, the Mamluks immediately retook Syria. The Mongol garrisons left behind were isolated and quickly overwhelmed. Damascus returned to Mamluk control without major fighting, the population rising against the Mongol occupation. The brief reconquest had achieved nothing permanent. The final confrontation came in 1303 at Marj al-Safa, south of Damascus. Ghazan had died, but his successor Ol-Jaitu continued his policies. Another Mongol army, perhaps 80,000 strong, invaded Syria. The Mamluks, now under Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, met them with an army of similar size. This was the culmination of 40 years of military evolution on both sides. The Mamluks deployed innovations that would have astonished the warriors of Ain Jalut. They used fire weapons, primitive hand cannons and rockets that created noise and smoke to panic horses. They employed sophisticated combined arms tactics, coordinating cavalry, infantry and missile troops in ways that reflected decades of tactical refinement. They had studied not just the Mongols, but every available text on military, science, including translated works from China and India. The battle lasted 3 days, an almost unprecedented duration for a medieval cavalry engagement. The Mongols threw everything they had at the Mamluk line. Wave after wave of cavalry charged, attempting to break through by sheer persistence. The Mamluks absorbed these attacks, countercharged when opportunities appeared, and systematically ground down the Mongol army through attrition. On the 3rd day, the Mongol army broke, not through any single dramatic moment, but through accumulated exhaustion, casualties, and demoralization. Units that had fought continuously for 72 hours simply could not continue. Horses were blown, men were wounded, ammunition was exhausted. When the Mamluks launched a general advance on the morning of the 4th day, they found an enemy that could no longer resist effectively. The retreat became a rout. Thousands of Mongol warriors died in the pursuit. Others were captured, including many high-ranking commanders. The army that reached Persia was a fraction of the force that had invaded Syria. And critically, it was the last serious Mongol attempt to conquer Egypt or permanently occupy Syria. After Marj al-Safar, the Ilkhanate turned its attention to internal problems and conflicts with other Mongol khanates. The transformation was complete. In 43 years, from 1260 to 1303, the Mamluks had gone from desperate defenders facing extinction to dominant military power in the Middle East. They had not just survived the Mongol onslaught, they had defeated it decisively across multiple campaigns. The tactics developed at Ain Jalut had evolved into a complete military system capable of consistent victory. The key to Mamluk success was institutional learning. After each battle, commanders conducted detailed debriefings. What had worked? What had failed? How could tactics be improved? This information was codified in training manuals and taught to the next generation of warriors. The Mamluks created a military culture based on professionalism and continuous improvement rather than tradition and individual heroism. The contrast with the Mongols was stark. Mongol military doctrine had remained largely unchanged since the time of Genghis Khan. The tactics that had worked brilliantly against unprepared enemies in the 13th century were still being employed in the early 14th century, even when facing enemies who understood them completely. The Mongol military system was based on cultural practices of steppe nomads that had been militarized. It was extraordinarily effective, but it was not designed for rapid adaptation. The Mamluks, by contrast, had no cultural baggage. They were taken from their homes as children and trained to be soldiers. They had no traditional tactics to defend, no ancestral methods to preserve. They could adopt whatever worked, discard whatever failed, and continuously refine their approach based on experience. This institutional flexibility was their decisive advantage. The economic factors were also crucial. The Mongol Empire was vast, but its productive capacity was limited. The steppes that supported Mongol horse herds could not support intensive agriculture. The empire relied on conquest and tribute rather than internal development. When the easy conquests ended, when every remaining enemy had learned to fight back, the economic model began to fail. Egypt, by contrast, had one of the richest agricultural economies in the medieval world. The Nile flood cycle provided reliable harvests that could support a large urban population and a professional military caste. The trade routes through Egypt connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia provided customs revenues that funded the military machine. The Mamluks could afford to train warriors for 15 years before they ever saw combat. The Mongols needed warriors immediately to maintain control over their vast territories. The religious factor played an unexpected role. Hulagu and his immediate successors were not Muslims, though they ruled over predominantly Muslim populations. This created tensions that the Mamluks exploited. Baibars positioned himself as the defender of Islam, the warrior who had defeated the Mongol threat to the Islamic world. When the Khans converted to Islam in the late 13th century, it removed some of this propaganda advantage but also made them less distinct from their subjects. The fierce loyalty that had characterized early Mongol armies faded as the ruling class became more integrated with the conquered populations. By 1320, the Ilkhanate was in decline. Civil wars over succession, economic problems, and military defeats had sapped its strength. The Mongol military system that had conquered half the known world could not sustain a permanent empire. The empire fragmented into competing dynasties, many of which quickly forgot their Mongol heritage and adopted local customs and religions. The Mamluk Sultanate, by contrast, endured. It survived the Black Death that devastated much of the 14th century world. It fought off the Ottoman Turks for decades. It maintained its military effectiveness for over 200 years after Ain Jalut. When it finally fell in 1517, it was not through military defeat in the traditional sense, but through the introduction of gunpowder weapons that made armoured cavalry obsolete. The legacy of Ain Jalut extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. It demonstrated that the seemingly unstoppable could be stopped, that tactical systems could be countered through study and preparation, that institutional learning mattered more than individual heroism. These lessons were studied by military theorists for centuries. European armies in the 14th and 15th centuries adopted Mamluk tactics for dealing with mobile cavalry forces. The importance of discipline, the use of combined arms, the value of institutional training rather than feudal levies, all of these concepts were reinforced by the Mamluk example. When European powers began to professionalize their militaries in the early modern period, they were following a path the Mamluks had pioneered. The Mongol conquests had demonstrated the power of mobility, coordination, and psychological warfare. They had shown what a disciplined military system based on meritocracy rather than heredity could achieve. But Ain Jalut and its successors demonstrated the limits of that system. The Mongols had created an effective military machine, but they had not created a learning organization. When faced with enemies who adapted and evolved, they could not adjust rapidly enough to maintain their dominance. In the broader sweep of military history, Ain Jalut stands as an example of an inflection point. The Mongol system had been refined through decades of conquest. It represented the peak of pre-gunpowder cavalry warfare as practiced by steppe peoples. The Mamluk system represented a different approach. Professional soldiers trained from childhood in a systematic program, supported by a sophisticated state apparatus that could sustain long-term military operations. When these two systems clashed, the more adaptable one prevailed. The human cost of these conflicts was staggering. Tens of thousands of warriors died in battles whose names are barely remembered today. Entire populations were displaced, cities destroyed, economies ruined. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century rank among the most destructive events in human history, with death tolls that likely exceeded 30 million across Asia and Europe. That this destruction was stopped before it could extend fully into Africa and the Middle East was due largely to the Mamluks' success at Ain Jalut and subsequent battles. The archaeological evidence from the battlefield sites is fragmentary. Medieval cavalry battles left few traces compared to later conflicts with their trenches and fortifications. But excavations near Ain Jalut have uncovered arrowheads of both Mongol and Mamluk manufacture, fragments of lamella armour, and horse bones showing signs of combat trauma. These mundane artifacts are all that remain of the battle that changed the course of empires. The historical memory of Ain Jalut varies dramatically by culture. In the Arab world, it is remembered as a decisive victory that saved Islamic civilization from extinction. Baibars and Qutuz are celebrated as heroes, their portraits appear in textbooks, and the battle is taught as an example of successful resistance to foreign invasion. In Egypt especially, where nationalism has often drawn on Mamluk imagery, Ain Jalut occupies a central place in historical consciousness. In Mongolia, and among Mongol successor states, the battle is often downplayed or contextualized as a minor setback in the broader arc of Mongol conquests. The focus tends to remain on the successes, on the creation of the largest contiguous land empire in history, rather than on the battles that marked its limits. This is understandable. National narratives emphasize triumphs rather than defeats, and the Mongol conquest provided plenty of triumphs to celebrate. In Western historical memory, Ain Jalut barely registers. The battle receives perhaps a paragraph in general histories of the medieval period, far less attention than Western European battles that were arguably less significant. This reflects the Eurocentrism of much historical writing, which focuses on events that directly affected European states. The fact that the Mongol defeated Ain Jalut may have saved Europe from further invasion by making clear that westward expansion was no longer viable tends to be overlooked. Modern military historians studying Ain Jalut focus on several key lessons. First, the importance of training and discipline. The Mamluks succeeded not through superior technology or numbers, but through superior execution of complex tactics under pressure. This reinforces the fundamental principle that in military affairs, how you use your tools matters more than what tools you have. Second, the value of intelligence and preparation. The Mamluks studied their enemy, understood Mongol tactics, and developed specific counters. They didn't try to fight the Mongols on Mongol terms. They fought them on terrain and in circumstances that favoured Mamluk strengths. This remains a fundamental principle of military strategy. Shape the battle to your advantage rather than accepting the enemy's preferred conditions. Third, the necessity of adaptation. Military systems that cannot evolve in response to changing conditions are doomed to obsolescence. The Mongols' failure to significantly adapt their tactics in response to Mamluk counters contributed to their eventual defeat. The Mamluks' willingness to continuously refine their approach gave them a crucial edge. This lesson resonates in modern military doctrine's emphasis on learning organizations and adaptive tactics. Fourth, the reality that no military advantage is permanent. The Mongols had dominated military affairs for 40 years, defeating every enemy they faced. The dominance bred a certain complacency, an assumption that their methods were inherently superior. Ain Jalut shattered that assumption, demonstrating that military superiority is always conditional and temporary. Enemies learn, adapt, and find counters. The battlefield itself has changed beyond recognition. Modern agriculture has transformed the Jezreel Valley. The spring that gave Ain Jalut its name still flows, but it's now surrounded by Israeli and Palestinian settlements, farms, and infrastructure. There is no monument marking where Kitbuqa fell or where Baibars led his famed retreat. The dust has long since settled, the blood long since washed away. But the consequences of what happened there continue to shape the modern world. The survival of a strong Islamic state in Egypt and Syria influenced the development of the region for centuries. The Mamluk Sultanate's success created a model of military professionalism that influenced later Islamic empires, including the Ottomans, who eventually defeated them. The techniques developed to counter Mongol cavalry influenced European military development as knowledge of these battles spread westward. In the final analysis, Ain Jalut mattered not because of what happened on September 3rd, 1260, but because of what didn't happen afterward. The Mongols did not conquer Egypt. They did not destroy the last major Islamic power. They did not continue westward into Africa or back into Europe through the Mediterranean. The empire that had seemed destined to encompass the entire known world reached its limit on a battlefield in Palestine. The Mamluks, slave soldiers who had seized power in a desperate moment, proved that determination, training, and tactical skill could defeat even the most feared military force of the age. They demonstrated that the arc of conquest was not inevitable, that empires could be stopped, that military systems could be countered. In doing so, they changed history. The charge that had broken armies from China to Hungary finally met warriors who would not break. The tactics that had seemed invincible were countered and defeated. The empire that had appeared unstoppable was stopped. On that September day in 1260, the world learned that even Mongols could be beaten. Everything that followed flowed from that realization. The age of unchallenged Mongol military supremacy was over. The age of adapting to and countering steppe warfare had begun, and it began at Ain Jalut, where the spring of Goliath witnessed giants fall.